welcome to At the Table with AACC, or the Asian American Christian Collaborative. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian leaders and pastors are able to draw from their experiences, their expertise, and their education to discuss questions and issues and topics that impact the Asian American Christian community, church, and the church at large. We're here today at the historic Chinese Community Church of Washington, D.C., and located in the heart of Chinatown in our nation's capital. The church was founded in 1935 and is the only Chinese church in D.C. proper, so it holds significance. We'll actually be talking today about cultural relevance, strategies for making Christianity relevant to younger generations and addressing many of the cultural shifts we're seeing today. Now, I will begin by saying Christianity is always relevant, and so let's start with that caveat and the clarity there. But it does seem to resonate in different ways, as we know that the message and the medium are oftentimes hindrances to each other, or the hurdle that people have to overcome. And so I'm curious, as we look at the current landscape, because one of the work, in addition to serving as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, I lead an effort called the 10 by 10 collaboration as the executive director. And that effort is trying to make faith matter more for 10 million young people over the course of the next 10 years through a collaborative kind of endeavor. And one of the things that we're seeing is that 1 million young people are walking away from the faith each and every year. It's actually closer to 1.4 million in the year 2023. And one of the challenges that we're noticing is that Christianity doesn't seem to be resonating with younger generations, in part because of our presentation of it and our demonstration of it. And so I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves and kind of share what you're seeing, especially in light of the changes generationally from the moments from the time you grew up, if you grew up in the church, what changes you've seen in the Christian church and the Christian faith within your context, as well as in your time doing ministry. And I love that we have a spectrum of people that are represented. You're more newly starting out in ministry, more formal ministry. You've been in youth ministry for quite some time, for a little over a decade. And Carl, you're a seasoned vet here. And so please introduce yourselves and kind of share what you're seeing across time, and especially since you began ministry.
So my name is Felix Chiu. I am a pastoral intern focusing on young adult ministry at the Chinese Bible Church of Maryland. And I think just over time, more recently in particular, there's just been a lot more information flow when it comes to our younger people and just in our world in general. And I think that's just a big challenge because there's so many more voices that people can hear. You can hear different things in the news. You are engaged to a different extent on social issues through social media. And so I think that's one of the bigger challenges that's coming up more in our recent times.
I'm Carl Park. I'm a pastor at Great Commission Community Church in Arlington, Virginia. I would agree with both things the things that both of you said. I would say something that has come to the forefront, I don't know if it's changed or if it's just been revealed more or less, is like the American church's particular demonstration and articulation of the Christian gospel. And I think some holes or some flaws have definitely become very apparent, and I think continuing to become very apparent. And like I said, I wouldn't attribute that so much to a change, but I feel like as time has passed, I feel like I myself, I'm sort of seeing it better and better. Something that probably has been around since I was a kid. So that would be
Can you actually unpack that a little bit before we go to Dorothy? Because I'd be curious. Like you're saying that you're seeing some holes, and it almost feels like a revelatory reckoning that's been taking place. What's leading to? What are the holes, and what's leading to the seeing of that?
I think one concrete hole I could think of, or concrete feature, is sort of this marriage between the American church and like a political party, and I think that's been there for some time. I would say probably since maybe 1980ish. But I think just over the past, I would say decade, it's become like that much clearer, sort of the problems with a church that is that intertwined politically, with a in a partisan way. And I know something that we talk about a lot is of course we have to be political. It's just people living in this world, but in terms of like partisanship and just sort of like an expectation and history of the church being so ensconced in that partisan way. And I think that has caused our faith to be misrepresented. It's caused our faith to be like very skewed and I think flawed. And I think in the larger scheme of things, as people, younger people in the church, or growing up in the church, people outside the church, like we said, we have a problem with the way it's been demonstrated and articulated, and it makes sense that Christianity is seen as something that's either irrelevant or just, something that is not viable.
Yeah. So I do want to kind of flesh that out a little bit. It sounds like what you're saying is that by the American church, you're primarily talking about the white evangelical church, which has, which research history shows took a very intentional effort to be married with a particular party, and then that has, and that was primarily through the moral majority movement in the 70s that you were talking about. And we see that there are different populations that have tendencies to vote in particular ways. So the majority of white evangelicals will vote in one way. The majority of black Protestants will vote in another way. The majority of Asian evangelicals, even though Asian Americans, they don't really identify with the term evangelical. I didn't know what evangelical was until I probably started or finished seminary, actually. I never understood, like people would interchange that with Protestant. I'm like, well, not all Protestants are evangelicals, so what does that mean? And I love the word evangel in the Greek because it simply means, the gospel or the good news. But one of the things I just wanted to kind of lay out, and I'm sure that this is what you were alluding to, was that while there might be different populations that vote in terms of percentages in particular ways, it seemed like at least with the moral majority movement, there was an intentional kind of marriage between a particular party at its roots with the Christian identity and Christian commitment.
Sort of, if you're a Christian, that means
you have to be this.
Related in this way.
Yeah. And so maybe we can unpack that a little bit more. But I am also very mindful that it's not always easy to talk about that in certain settings. And so, Dorothy.
It's really hard to follow, but hi everyone, I'm Dorothy Lau, and I'm the youth director at the Chinese Bible Church of Maryland in Rockville, Maryland. So working with middle and high school students, some connectedness with college students, but I think overall something that I'm seeing that can be a struggle or in some ways problematic is just the simple tag word of priority. Priority, it's like, what can the gospel do for me that I can't do for myself? So it's really the emphasis on self-sufficiency and like, why should I trust Jesus if I trust myself more? So I think because of that, it leads students to focus on other things, alternatives fill their time, and usually they're extracurriculars that help them get ahead in life, but not necessarily get ahead in their faith. So it's a struggle in that if it's not necessarily being prioritized in the home, it's not going to be a consistent priority in their own lives, especially in adulthood.
Now, it does seem like there is a growing gap between the generations, how generations understand and receive and experience the Christian message, Christian community, Christian commitments, Christian doctrine. One of the things I cited earlier was that there's 1 million young people walking away from their faith. And that spans across the various racial lines. What do you think is contributing to some of that? And are there any things particularly unique to the Asian American context that would be contributing to that? And by Asian American, obviously, we represent a small subsect of the Asian American population. I think we're Chinese and Korean, with someone who has adopted a lot of Korean vernacular, and we appreciate that. And if you get to know,
I don't think we don't want people
yeah, you speak
come
a lot.
all things to all men.
That's right. And you have a lot of Korean, like you have a lot of like knowledge of Korean culture, and you always surprise me with a lot of the Korean language.
Just watch too many dramas.
But like, are there any kind of like, what do you think is leading to the departure, especially of the younger generation? And then, is there anything unique from the context that we are most knowledgeable of?
Actually, I want to cite something from one of my church's elders, and he said something in one of our youth volunteers training planning day. He said that oftentimes if there's feedback coming from youth about any retreat or an event of some sort, there can be a common response of, I wish it was more engaging. But what this particular elder said is that we need to be careful not to simply cater to the desire for engagement when that could be confused with the desire to be entertained. So meaning that what some students or young people, I don't want to just isolate to teenagers, like what young people might be looking for isn't necessarily to be interacting, but just to be amused, or like catch my attention, try to keep my attention, and if you can't, then I'm just going to go somewhere else, which in a way just means I want to consume. So if you cannot like capture my attention or affections, then I'm going to go to somewhere that will just cater to me. So the whole idea of understanding what's the difference between engagement and entertainment is passive, engagement is active. So if students say, I want to be more engaged, or I want you to engage me, sometimes it could be convoluted or just misunderstood as, I just want you to entertain me. I want you to make me feel something. But in a way I understand, because the gospel can't simply be informational, it should be transformational. But if our students or young people come into any context, especially a spiritual community, where they're just looking to consume, it's like, well, you can keep eating, but if there's no output, you're constipated or obese. You can look at it in different ways. But I think that's a big thing, is entertainment and engagement. Like, is it being equated, or is there a true difference? And I think there is a difference.
And that's good, especially because we live in a society where we have this infinite scroll, and everyone is getting these bite-sized clips where they're entertained in very curated ways that seem very organic for like 7 to 20 to 30 to 90 seconds. I'm still like shaken by this one thing that someone said to me. He's in college at a very kind of highly academic institution, and he said that many of his friends can't even sit through a movie anymore because their attention span has become so short that even movies aren't capturing their attention. And if we know how movies are made, we know that they're constantly shifting scenes so that they keep your attention going, so from one camera angle to another, like every few seconds. I mean, even if you just watch like a commercial and say, how often are they switching camera angles and scenes? It's shocking how many times they do that in any given episode. And so it's worth considering. And so what you're saying is totally kind of resonating.
Yeah, I mean, to the same point of just not only just attention span, but the convenience of being able to move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Like you referenced it as well. We can just, with the flick of your finger, you can kind of move on to something that's more appealing to you. And I think that's just a part of the challenge, is that it's so accessible to just be entertained. You don't really have to leave your house. You don't really have to. All you need is a device in your hand. And I think that speaks to the challenge that Dorothy is pointing out here, I suppose.
I'm going to take your question slightly.
Yeah, take it in a different direction.
Because, like, I guess I would like to highlight the lack of chasm, I guess, between generations, or the continuity.
Yeah.
Because something I feel like I'm finding is that people of I'm pretty much Gen X, and so if we kind of think of our people as like Gen X, millennial, or Gen X and down, Gen X, millennial, Gen Z. I feel like there's a lot of continuity, actually, and I think for even people who are more Gen X, and even people who have been part of the church for a long time, just over time, your faith grows, and sometimes a better word for that is evolves. And I feel like some of the questions that people who are Gen Xers, the Christian Gen Xers, have had to wrestle with, especially thinking about the relevance and viability of Christian faith, are the same ones that millennials and Gen Z people are also wrestling with. And I don't know, I have a daughter who's Gen Z, I have kids that are Gen Z, but thinking of my daughter and just how much overlap there is in our questions.
But give me an example.
I guess just going back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, how does this work? Like, as Christians, why are we aligned with this particular, or why is it this thing that we're supposed to be aligned with this party?
Yeah,
is that
Like political affiliation.
Yeah, exactly. Or questions of sexuality, questions of things that maybe traditionally are more considered like taboo. Like mental health issues, mental motivation. Just as a Christian, like can we be depressed and Christian, or is there something deficient or problematic with our faith? It's like, well, no. And so, how do we think about that? How do we tackle the reality of, over the last, especially 20 years, all the abuse that we've seen in, especially the Roman Catholic Church, but also in a lot of Protestant churches, different kinds of abuse and protection of organizations, and how can we be self-critical as a church, or as a person? Can I, with a good conscience, still consider myself a Christian or be part of a church? It's almost like, is being a Christian immoral? And so I feel like there is continuity, and those kind of questions that I feel like people that are my peers are asking, or have been asking, and just like Gen Z people might be asking as well.
Good. Yeah, I mean, so you're seeing more, so you're saying there's not that big of a generational gap. Would you agree with that? Because I do feel like they're making, when I talk to younger people, they're making me ask questions that I knew were in the back of my mind, but I never thought to ask. And so I wonder if it's what's common within the generational kind of thinking and the boundaries of what's normal versus because I agree with you, and I'm also trying to say, well, then is there anything different between the generations, and why are we seeing such a stark departure now in ways that seems to only be accelerating? Or maybe it was a slow departure that's gaining momentum, kind of like a flywheel that gained full that time.
Well, I suspect that the departure that we're talking about, there certainly is an exacerbator or a bigger departure with the younger generation. But I get the suspicion that with Gen X as well as millennials, there's also a departure there. So to Carl's point, I think in terms of the questions that are being asked, I think there is some continuity there. And I do think Asian Americans have a relatively unique added layer that comes with it, because not only are we questioning the Christian tradition of a lot of these viewpoints, but we have to deal with the tension of, should we speak up against our elders? Should we speak up against a older generation that's supposed to know better? And so it can feel like it's easier to just leave the church. Sometimes ideally leave to another church that's more accepting, but a lot of times leave the church altogether rather than try to work with an older generation. So I think that's something that's more unique to younger people and also more unique to Asian Americans specifically.
I would say there is continuity in some ways, but then there's dissonance in another. I always like to think about it practically. So like, I would say there is more cohesiveness between Gen X and millennials because we both grew up on dial-up internet. Whereas Gen X, like, they've only known like high-speed internet. And
Gen Z?
I'm sorry, that's Gen Z. I misspoke. And if there's no Wi-Fi, they believe they're going to die, you know? Whereas in a sense, even though situationally it's different, then the continuity comes where similar questions are being asked, but in different spheres, or like different applications. And so I do find that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are thinking like, I'm just not satisfied with a simple answer anymore. It's kind of like the 3 or 4 year old that keeps asking, but why? And it's like, I already told you. But they want to go deeper, except even if they have a deeper understanding, what I find is that those truths don't really affect them. They just want to know the answer. And if it doesn't actually permeate into a specific area of life, they're just accumulating more knowledge. They can keep Googling, but they don't actually put that into application. So in a way, it's like, I want to know the answer so that I can respond to someone and tell them that I know the answer, but how does that play out in a specific part of my life? Maybe not yet, or because of the complexity of today's social, cultural, adolescent landscape, they see a lot more than what millennials and Gen X have seen when they were in school, right? And that comes from what I believe like globalization, dissemination of information, the fact that TikTok and Instagram can capture your attention within like a handful of seconds and boil down supposedly an entire Bible passage and its main points, but then our students, our young people aren't actually studying the scriptures for themselves to actually wrestle with these issues. They just want the answer.
Yeah. By wanting the answers, I just want to kind of get clarity.
Yeah.
Are you saying that they just want an answer that they can regurgitate or memorize, internalize? What do you mean they want the answer?
They want the answer in that sometimes there's just a curiosity, and having an answer settles their mind in that time or in that season. It could also be that they want an answer because they don't want to come off as being ignorant. I think that being in this particular region, knowledge is very much important. It's key. It means that you're intelligent, you have understanding, you're cultured, and you know how to comprehend or grasp abstract concepts. But for students who may be asking questions, there could be a very valid reason why they're asking questions. But then to ask in follow-ups, like, so why do you ask? Like, oh, I just wanted to know. Maybe they're being coy, or maybe there is something that's deeper that they don't know how to process and think about, but that's just getting them started. But it could be a myriad of things as to why they're asking. It's just trying to help them to understand the layering of what is it that has sparked the curiosity, so that we as ministers can come alongside them to understand them better, and they can understand themselves better, and it help them grow in self-awareness and the solidity of their faith and how that looks when it's actually a practice.
That's good. So we're all from different contexts. Well, both of you serve in the same context, but you know, Carl, you're at a predominantly Asian-led, some Asian-dominant multi-ethnic church that is more young than it is older. You're at a fairly kind of established multi-site, 2-site Chinese American church that's been around for a while. I'm curious, when it comes to some of these generational differences, navigating kind of the discipleship of young people, seeing all the shifts taking place, the departures taking place, are there any unique things that you feel like need to be addressed that aren't being addressed, that emerge from the uniqueness of your context? Or do you feel like, no, whatever strategies everyone else is using, whatever problems everyone else is facing, we're facing, and whatever strategies everyone else is using, we're also using? I feel like you kind of mentioned a little bit about how, you were wrestling through some of the generational stuff, but I'm curious, are there any other things that kind of distinctly emerge as issues to be named, as well as strategies to be to address them?
That's a complex question, right?
Well,
but I would say, like, something that just came to my mind is how personality and preferences are not an excuse for sin. Something that Felix and I were talking about recently was how much this current landscape of information, of social movements, it advocates for quote unquote liberation, were your words, right? But at the same time, does this sense of like buck wild freedom, does it lead closer to Christ, questionably, or is it actually like pushing and, well, maybe pushing is not the right word, but is it making one with the greater proclivity or inclined towards sin? And so that's something we're just becoming more aware of, is like, is our personality, is our preference, is that actually gospel, or is it actually something that is leading us farther away from Christ?
So give us an example of when a personality or proclivity or preference isn't a sin, and when it might be a sin.
I would say in the case that it would be sin is a preference or tendency to be more confrontational. And while we can speak the truth, are we doing so in love? I'll just use myself. An example is being caught in a situation, maybe not caught is not the right word, being in a situation where there needs to be open dialogue. Maybe I hurt someone or someone hurt me, and coming to the table, no pun intended, to talk about that openly, but not just to make accusations of a you said, I said, or this is what you said and how I interpret it, it could have been wrong. So it's just misunderstandings flying back and forth, but the sin being like, I have offended you, but I'm not gonna own up to it because like I did nothing wrong. So it's refusing to acknowledge in any situation that wrong was done. Is that going to be wholesome talk? Is that going to be encouraging talk in any way? Is the goal of that conversation restoration, or is it retribution? I think it's just so important to have a firm grasp and clarity and sober-mindedness on how that conversation occurs. In the event that, on the flip side, right, that it wouldn't be sin, is then to say, like, is this conversation done in love? Is it actually focused on truth or just my interpretation of what was said? And is there a mutual desire to both understand and be understood? And so it can be a slippery slope at times, because communication is not a strong suit in the Asian American community, because what we say we don't mean, and what we mean we don't really say, meaning that there's a passive aggression, indirect communication, and we fear sometimes being impolite, so we'll just say things that appeases the other, but it doesn't actually resolve a situation or the relationship.
Agree, disagree? What would you add on? We're taking a different direction.
Yeah. But I would say Gen Z tends to be even just a little bit more confrontational than earlier generations. And I really respect that about my students, about like early grads in college now, because they're willing to actually talk about issues, because they've grown up with a much more volatile political, social environment. And so that's where I admire their courage for being willing to even speak, whereas earlier generations would rather not speak so as to keep peace and harmony.
Yeah. That's right, I think maybe piggybacking off that, as well as answering your question about strategies. Something that happens in our church is we have small groups or smaller groups, and and they're all different in their makeup, but a lot of them are a combination of these generations that we were just talking about: Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z. Not quite the Alpha quite yet, but in these adult groups, you have you have that, I think, that dynamic that you're talking about, like a younger group. I mean, it depends on the people, obviously, but I think we could say there is a generational, just easier time of speaking out and expressing ourselves, and like just calling out things, calling a spade, and so on, than older generations. But I think those groups where these generations can mix, and I think it's really important, especially like, as teenagers, or maybe at any age, it's really important to have peers in the faith. Like, if you can have that, it's so great. And at the same time, if you can have sort of that mix of where, you have kind of cultural generations together, and talking about these things together, seeing points of continuity as well as discontinuity, being able to hear each other, being able to have someone else voice the things that maybe you wanted to voice but you couldn't quite, or you didn't know how to, having perspectives of others as well. I mean, I think that's really special, and and I wonder about that also with like even younger Gen Z or Alpha, and I think that's something for our churches to consider going forward, or I'm sure they've been considering it for a long time actually, but thinking about how do we integrate a younger group, like a teenage group, for example, with adults in our congregation, and I've seen that, like I mentioned my daughter before, but she doesn't really have really close peers in our church. The kids are a little bit younger, and so she's sort of in between. But she's become like friends with people who are older, who are older Gen Z, Millennial, and so on. And I think it's been really helpful for her. And so I could see that as something that churches, would consider, like how do we do that intentionally and well.
So it does make a difference when people are in the same room together, because it forces you to confront the reality of their presence and existence. And that transforms not only our disposition, but information, knowledge, dispositions, understanding can be shared in ways that it's not if you're just scrolling or if you know that they're in the other room. One of the problems I see with the kind of the industrial complex of the church today is how everything is so segmented and fragmented that we've separated cohorts by generations, that older people are not with younger people, that men are not with women, and so on and so forth. Not that there's no space for there to be opportunities for people to connect with their cohorts, but we've almost kind of overblown it. I'm curious if there's any kind of specific things that you're doing, or if you're seeing things, because I think this is a critical piece that can help bridge the divides of bringing people together. Where are you bringing people together? How do you bring them together? What do those interactions look like, and what are you seeing as a result of even like the impact of the interactions between your kids and those that are in older cohorts than them? Yeah,
well, I think there's for our church, we don't really have anything that cohort driven. So kind of everything's for everybody in some ways. And I think that's been great. It wasn't by design, it's just kind of the way it's happened. I think it's been really helpful, really. I mean, it creates some problems too. I mean, it's not as easy in some ways, and some problems are like trivial. You just like, how do we communicate in this group? Do we email? It's like, who checks email? Like tags, like what kind of media are we using? Something like that. But I think just the benefits have been, really beautiful.
I mean, I think coming from a church that does have more well-defined cohorts, as you could phrase it, I think one of the more unique challenges of having a more fully intergenerational church is the challenge of, I guess, retaining the people that grew up at your church. And I think in a lot of ways, it seems like it would just be a lot easier if I could serve at a church that doesn't have that problem, where like there aren't any people that, the church is young enough that nobody's graduated from college and had to come back and kind of reacclimate themselves to the church. And so I find that like working with young adults, working with college students, a lot of it is allowing them, students or these individuals to kind of grasp the faith for their own when they're always around their parents, or just like their parents are in the same congregation, or they used to always drive them to the same church. It's a lot less of an incentive as opposed to kind of being a part of something new and kind of starting fresh. And I think that's one of the challenges of working at such a context, is that like it's a few weeks ago there was a couple that I'm pretty sure they were dedicated at the church and they got married at the exact same church, and like that's so rare these days. You don't really see people doing that in general. Whether it's just because of lifestyle transience, but also because there isn't that same type of decades-long commitment. And so I think that's one thing that is, I don't really have an effective strategy. I'm trying to work on that, but I think across the board, whether it's Asian American or majority culture churches, they're kind of running into the same problem. And so that's another element of kind of this issue that you're raising.
Yeah, it's hard to be an adult in the church of your parents. Mm-hmm. And specifically in the Asian American context, that's just not new, because it's always been the elders who have stewarded leadership, but not necessarily been the ones to guide and lead the younger in how to lead. It's just, oh, I'm tired, I'm gonna retire, and I'm old. Someone else should take it up. But then there was no succession of leadership. It wasn't even passing the baton. It's like, I'm just gonna place it here and someone can pick it up. Mm-hmm. And I think while I understand the method behind it, I think it can in some ways be irresponsible, because it's assumed that someone will just take up a mantle. But I believe that even Jesus himself made invitations for his disciples to follow him. Jesus didn't just say, all right, now you're gonna pick up your cross, right? And do I have to show you how to do it? Are you gonna do it? No, but Jesus modeled all of that. So not only is it hard to be an adult in your parents' church, but if young people seldom had the opportunity to even observe and partake in leadership opportunities, then it makes sense why that silent exodus continues. It makes sense why they will go to spaces and places where they will find a majority culture, or just be in places where they just see their friends because it's easier. And if they hadn't been challenged younger, then they will continue to pursue places that will fill them, but not necessarily challenge them.
So, what are some of the most significant challenges or issues or needs that the Asian American church needs to address in light of younger generations, and in order to make sure that we're reaching them effectively? What do we need to do in order to pass the baton well?
Big question, right? I would, I think I would echo Dorothy in saying that, yeah, you really need to empower and give voice and leadership. Hey, let's do it your way, kind of thing, to younger generations, younger people. I think I know you have a multi-site church. Our church is also, like we have two sort of congregations, two locations. And, I think, yeah, like starting more locations and sites and things like that, and giving people an opportunity to lead, giving new people, younger people, an opportunity to run with things. I think that's a big deal. Yeah, I mean, it's when we talk about the Asian American church or Asian American Christians, it's tough. I mean, I mean, it's a lot of the struggles that are, predominantly Asian American churches have, they mirror the struggles that, like churches of all stripes, all stripes in North America have. But in terms of like unique challenges, I would say at least one would be just the sense of what makes me or us unique as Asian Americans. Like is there a voice for that, like in the church? Like, is there a way that I'm hearing that articulated? What does that look like for me to be an Asian American who knows Jesus, whom Jesus knows, and to make sure that's being articulated, And I think especially for maybe successive like generations in terms of like immigrant, like first generation, second generation, and so on, because I wonder if like for a first generation person or someone who is a child of a first generation person, that sense of like being Asian American or that sense of identity, it is, I don't know, I feel like it has to be different for a third generation and a fourth generation Asian American. And like the way that was articulated in their understanding of Christ as a first or second generation person, just to make sure that like it's still a big part of your identity, and at least how you're perceived in this world. And so to make sure that as a church we're giving people tools and how to navigate this and how to, just scripts and voices that can help them like articulate, yes, I know Christ in this way and Christ knows me in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think off of what has just been said, I think open dialogue and open conversation, that is absolutely a very necessary aspect of it. But I think with Asian Americans, I think we have this tendency, I think Dorothy kind of referenced it as well, it's like as church leaders, we are shepherds. But in Asian American context, we tend to treat the sheep like workhorses. Like they're not intended to be like pulling a plow, but that's what we often expect from them. And so I think in order to try to rewrite that narrative a little bit, treating them more like sheep, giving them that personal care as you're getting at, and allowing them to be heard, but also understand what the pains that they're going through, whether that be directly in the church or just in culture. And I think that type of platform is where we can start making a change.
So, I mean, there's so many things that we have to navigate. We have, especially if we've been in established churches or we have long histories in the U.S. and churches learn from each other. I mean, even if you look at the history of certain churches, like the same pastor that founded one church was the pastor of another church and then went to another church. And so the DNA kind of spans, and they're not always even geographically centralized. It's the tradition kind of spreads across geographies. If those churches gain influence, they also then start influencing other churches. Mm-hmm. So traditions are formed in some of the ways that influence is embedded within these contexts. Then they get passed down from generation to generation. But then as they get passed down from generation to generation, tensions start to emerge because the culture around every generation begins to change. And so you then start asking questions around what is central and core to our church's tradition and identity, to what is important for us to adapt to and let go of in order to reach the next generation effectively. How do you navigate that as people from different kind of generational cohorts, different stages in ministry life? And how would you leave the conversation today in terms of like a word of encouragement for those who are navigating these challenges, especially as they're trying to reach the next generation?
So maybe another way of thinking about this question is how to understand and go about challenges, change, and the tensions which exist between older and younger generations.
And then a word of encouragement as people, for people who are navigating this and in their efforts to reach younger generations.
I would say more communication is better than little to no communication. And I say that because humorously, but at the same time seriously, I probably send the most amount of emails in my church because there is just so much that is assumed, and I don't want coworkers or lay people to A, be lost, to B, assume anything that could lead to misunderstanding, and then C, just so that they know and they're not caught off guard. And I do find that when there is uncertainty or unexpected outcomes, the level of defensiveness and combativeness increases. And so just being able to communicate in general and to communicate directly but firmly, but kindly, of course, it alleviates some of the tension of, so is this my responsibility or your responsibility? Or another way to say it is, so who would you like to take care of this? Or may I help? So instead of just volunteering, it's people are volunteering, or they are gladly taking on something that is for the welfare and the benefit of the ministry and for the church and for their brothers and sisters. So that's where communication, I think, though it may be a challenge, doing so in a way that builds people up, that gives them all the tools and the resources that they need, and that you're still walking alongside them. So change is going to happen, but I think it's just important to be aware too that we're not being syncretistic about it, meaning like this is the way the church has done it, or is it simply this is the Chinese way? And if we don't have that awareness, then we're going to assume that the cultural way is the gospel way. But a lot of traditions aren't necessarily biblical within an ethnic specific context. It's just that we may be fearful of a different dynamic because we don't know how to adapt to that uncertainty. But to do that in community versus in isolation would be much better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I would speak in terms of our faith and the gospel and years of Christian history. I would say from years of Christian history, an important thing to always keep in front of us is that the gospel has always been translated. Like that's the nature of the gospel. It's a missionary thing. And it's constantly being translated, and so that's why in language as well as in culture. And so every time we evangelize, every time we speak about Christ, part of what we're doing is we are translating the gospel for people. And it's just, that's how the gospel has thrived and continued to thrive over all these years. It's just constantly being translated and contextualized into new contexts. And so what we're doing is nothing to be afraid of as we're trying to understand the gospel well. Like, I guess what makes for a good translation, you have to know the material well and you have to know the cultures well. To both the original and the receptor culture, I guess. And so we want to do as good of a job as possible at that, but that is a job before us. And so it's never been a luxury that kind of truly thriving churches have had to just kind of sit in our ways and, hey, this is how we received it, so it's always going to be like this. But we've always had to try to translate that for new people and new cultures. And so as an encouragement for all of us, I would say, let's keep doing that. And let's be good translators of the gospel. Let's not be afraid of trying new things and asking new questions and not having certain answers because there are new questions. And it's okay that we don't have set answers. And it's okay that we'll maybe take a while to get to those answers, And but that's just what we do as people of the gospel. So yeah, let's keep at it.
Yeah, I was going to say something actually rather similar, but I think you look at some of the more contemporary issues and questions that really drive people away from the church, things such as sexuality, whether that be through like LGBT expressions or premarital sex, or things just such as like how you want to pursue your passions in life, whether it be through pursuing money or your career. these are not new things. These are things that Paul directly talked about in Romans 1. And so these are things that have just always plagued the church from the beginning of its church. And so just living out that gospel, not that Christianity has this perception of being this restrictive set of rules that prevent us from living the way that we want to live, but I think the gospel gives us a greater freedom from that way of life, and that's something that we need to live out as church leaders, and we need to live out as a church right now. If we don't live it out, it's just going to come across as just a list of rules. But if we can reach them with love and reach them with the heart of Christ, I think we can start to make a difference in the next generation.
Well, this is great. Such a rich conversation. Thanks for being at the table with us. Looking forward to more.